Hello and welcome to the 10th edition of Exploring Enterprise, the podcast series from the Enterprise Research Centre. My name is Mark Hart, I'm the Deputy Director of the ERC, and today I'm joined by Philip King, who was previously the Small Business Commissioner and responsible for advising small businesses on their trading relationships, a UK appointment. And also we're joined by Ant Persse, who's Chief Executive of Optimum Finance, a specialist invoice finance company, and also a newly established Saltare Technologies Limited, which is a Fintech that aims to support businesses with their payment challenges. And indeed, looking out at the landscape and context at the moment, payment challenges are certainly something which is occupying the minds of many small business owners that I talk to. So in terms of the focus today, the theme's going to be issues around late payment. And obviously this is something which has become even more crucial as 2022 it continues. At the turn of the year, there was a Federation of Small Business report on basically the problems that many small businesses, in particular micro enterprises, were facing with respect to late payment, and the call went out, we need to be doing something about this and doing something very quickly and draconianly. I think also when I look at the regular data coming out of the SME Finance Monitor, which is a quarterly survey which has been going on now for a number of years, giving us funded by many of the financial institutions and banks in the UK, we can see that certainly there's obviously more important issues perhaps have crept up the table in terms of major obstacles facing small businesses. Things like political uncertainty around the EU trading relationships. Obviously, the effects of the pandemic are still working through the economy, particularly in terms of absenteeism, which seems to be the biggest issue at the moment. We can certainly see that with respect to a lot of our travel, attempts at travel, I should say. But also, I think it's true to say that there's still a sizable proportion of businesses who are reporting that many of the obstacles and challenges they face about running their businesses relates to late payment and relates to cash flow. And certainly when you look at micro enterprises, we can see that nearly 1 in 6 of micro enterprises are saying this is a major obstacle to their operations. And when we factor in those who are saying, yeah, it's a problem, but we're working our way around it, we're getting up to nearly a third of all micro enterprises and small businesses who are facing these problems. So this is not an insignificant issue this year. And that's why the Centre has decided to bring this to the fore. And also we're looking at not just talking to Philip about the many years this has been a problem and the attempts that have been done to address this and the fantastic work he did when he was Commissioner. But also I'm interested in listening to ways in which the market itself is beginning to address some of these issues. And that's why I'm pleased to be joined by Ant today on this particular podcast as an entrepreneur who I've worked with on a high growth program, to bring a market solution to bear. And I think that's really the perspective here. We can always point the finger at government to do more, but I think what I'm excited about is the way in which there have been market solutions as well. So that's enough from me at the moment. I'm going to go over to you first, Philip. And in your previous role as the Small Business Commissioner, obviously this is something which was top of your inbox. Can you tell us a little bit more about what that work involved when you were in the post?
Yes, Mark, and thank you for having me on the podcast this morning. The SBC was established in 2017 to address unfavourable payment practice. It's an independent appointment by UK government. The intent is it will support small businesses in resolving disputes and obtaining payment from large businesses. And I was asked by government to step in for a few months to cover sort of a gap in having a commissioner. 6 months became 18 because of COVID. And during my time there, I spent most of my time talking to small businesses about the issues they were facing and helping them to resolve them, and to large businesses about the way in which they behaved and encouraging them to change their behaviour. It obviously involved a lot more, but that's the essence of it. So it's around communicating with businesses, encouraging good behaviour by big and getting small businesses to help themselves and to be helped by the larger businesses that they are supplying.
So, Philip, when you were talking to the small businesses, I mean, what were the sort of key practices that you were coming across which seemed to be common to many of them? What sort of things were you hearing that something needed to be done to address this issue?
Well, one of the key challenges is a large business that exploits its position of power. So it imposes long payment terms on its small supplier that feels unable to challenge. And one of my missions was to get small businesses to recognise that they could in fact challenge and shouldn't just roll over. But that's one of the key areas. Another is complex processes that large businesses have to process invoices and pay them. And small businesses all too often fall short in getting the invoice right, getting it to the right place with the right information on to enable it to be processed and paid. It's important to point out, I think, that not all large businesses deliberately pay late. It's often incompetence and inefficiency rather than willful exploitation of the small business. And one of the things that became apparent to me as small business commissioner from conversations I had with many chief execs and finance heads of large businesses was that there was often an ignorance of the impact they had. When I talked to them about paying someone late, their impression was of a spreadsheet with a few rows on it of invoices not paid. What they didn't see was the other end of the equation, where there was a micro business that was struggling to put cornflakes on the table. And getting them to understand the impact of their actions was one of the key things. And of course, while I was SBC, we moved the prompt payment code hosting from my previous organisation, the Chartered Institute of Credit Management, across to the SBC's office. And that got tightened up while I was in post. We changed the rules of that slightly, made it tougher. But that again is an example of big businesses wanting to do the right thing, and there are many of them. But I think the practices generally are, there's an extreme. So there are some large businesses that deliberately exploit their supply chain. They know they're doing it. They're just managing their cash flow better and avoiding paying small suppliers, but many aren't. And I think it's the middle ground that I think is the area that the sort of solution Ant's talking about can really help. When
we come into the pandemic in March 2020, Philip, I mean, this was certainly, when a government closes an economy down, this is sort of, a major event, and many small businesses were saying, it's not just a question of late payments, it's a question of, will I ever get paid again? Because there was this worry that many of these larger businesses would actually not be there. I mean, do you think that as the pandemic evolved, that larger businesses began to recognise that they ought to be doing the right thing to be helping these smaller businesses, or were they just really saying, survival of the fittest? If you haven't got cash reserves, tough.
I think there were some that took that view, and I spent a lot of time talking to them, trying to persuade them that they were wrong. But there were some that didn't. So I mean, early doors, Morrison started paying their smaller suppliers that supplied less than £1 million immediately, rather than going out to the terms. The other supermarkets followed suit. I guess peer pressure had a part to play in that, but it was nevertheless a good move. There were lots of good examples, and I'll share one, if I may, very quickly. Pete Redfern was then chief exec of Taylor Wimpey. He recognised that the impact that the COVID pandemic would have an impact on his smallest contractors and constructors. He went out at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, got his regional managers to call all the small contractors to assure them that they would be paid anything that was in the pipeline. Then he went a step further and he arranged for them to be paid in advance for work they had yet to do, so that when the pandemic ended and the sites reopened, they would be there to get back on site and start building again. And then he opened up his whole web portal that he had for his employees, his well-being mindfulness portal, to all the contractors to help them with mental health and well-being through the pandemic. And I shared a number of webinars with Pete early in the pandemic. And he really inspired me, because what he did was to say, we recognise the impact of this on our small suppliers, we're going to help them and we're going to bring them through. And he wasn't alone, there were lots of examples like that. But on the contrasting side, there were some who clearly had no interest and just focused on themselves.
Before I move on to Ant, I just want to get your view on something which I've come across in my work with small businesses over the years, and that is many of them are so desperate to get their products or services into larger organizations. I'm particularly thinking about the supermarkets, getting it on the shelf, etc., that they will do almost anything. They will sign almost anything in terms of terms just to be able to say my product's on the shelf in whatever category that we're looking at. Do you think that's a common, or is that a fair comment about many small business owners?
Absolutely. So I think that small businesses, they get an order from a large supermarket or a large retailer or a large manufacturer or whatever, and they think Christmas has arrived. And their only focus is having an association with that name. And they sign whatever they're given. I remember talking to a small contractor several years ago who'd been sent a 95-page contract to sign. He had no idea what was in it. He just signed it. And then he was complaining because he wasn't being paid. And the terms in the contract were 90 days. He hadn't even seen that, let alone understood it. And he was paying all his suppliers on 30 days, and he had a 60-day gap in his cash flow, which almost brought him down. And I think small businesses do just they're so pleased to get an order that they just sign. And I think the challenge is getting small businesses to recognise that risk and to negotiate. And when I was talking to chief execs through COVID, I didn't talk to one who didn't say, if we need to, we can help a small business. And I've talked to many small businesses who've gone back and said, I can't accept 90 days. Can't you do better than that? And even when the big business says, no, that's our standard, of course they can. They can raise a payment whenever they want to, and many do. And small business need to recognise that and to push back and to get terms that work for both parties. Otherwise, it's never going to work. It's not going to be a partnership. And supply trading relationships are about working together. They're about partnerships and communication.
And I think that's a perfect opportunity to turn to you. And with that example, you work directly supporting SMEs in accessing the cash they need to run their business. So from your experience, there's two things. Obviously, you recognize this as a problem and obviously recognize it as a market opportunity for your business. But can you just reflect upon the sort of stories you hear from small business owners in terms of the situation they get themselves in?
Yeah, sure. So firstly, Mark, thanks for inviting me to the podcast today. It's a pleasure to be here and catching up with you again. So where do I start? I always say that businesses don't fail because they're not profitable. They fail because they run out of cash. And the primary reason that businesses, or primary source of cash, is through proceeds of sale. So as a small business, it's absolutely paramount that I understand what I'm going to get paid and by when. This is what enables me to make decisions about my business, whether it be investment decisions, funding decisions, employment decisions, marketing decisions, etc. And let's put things into perspective that everyone will understand. Most of us will have a job and we get paid at the end of the month, and we know pretty much what we're going to get paid. That payment will be funding our mortgage, it will be funding our bills, and potentially leaving enough at the end of the day for us to go out on the weekend, put towards a holiday, an item of clothing or something like this. Imagine not being paid on the day that you expect it. The anxiety that would cause us. How am I going to pay my mortgage? How am I going to pay my bills? How am I going to be able to go out on the weekend or put it towards a holiday? This is the level of anxiety that businesses face every day when it comes to late payments. And we see it all of the time. I think that Philip's probably got plenty more examples of businesses that have suffered at the hands of late payments.
But I think in terms of how business owners get into that position, can you reflect a little bit more on the levels of anxiety that they create for themselves? I mean, these are people who come in offering sometimes quite innovative products, innovative services in the marketplace, and yet they don't seem to understand, or don't seem to, in many ways, as Philip was saying, negotiate those terms in a way as they would negotiate, the other aspects of running their business. So I'm just, are we saying that there's a level of financial literacy here among small businesses which is problematic?
Potentially, I think that there could be. I mean, the euphoria of winning a deal with the likes of one of the big players will just completely outshadow, what is in those terms of the contract. And many won't actually look at what they're signing up to, as Philip mentioned earlier, not realizing. He gave the example of a business that effectively signed a 90-page contract with, what was it, 60-day terms, Philip, 90-day terms.
Okay.
I mean, this is what happens all of the time. Now, there are solutions out there that are able to support it, and invoice finance is one of them, to help them bridge the gap that they might find themselves in. But I think that it is a case that, for many, it's achieving that goal of that massive sale just sort of takes over.
So, I mean, from your perspective, Ant, in terms of your positioning, I mean, what is it you're doing to try and broker this seeming mismatch between, I know we're generalizing here because, as we've already established, there's many larger firms are all doing the right thing and more. But I mean, what sort of ways can, I mean, there's been a lot of products out there, factoring, invoice finance, stuff like that, which have been around for a long, long time. This problem has been around for a long, long time. So where do you see we need to be a bit more innovative in terms of what we can do to solve the problem, not from a government perspective, but from a market perspective?
Sure. So I think the first thing is that we should help businesses focus on what they do best, which is delivering their businesses, and not necessarily having to chase payments, as an example. So there was a survey conducted by Tide that highlighted that SMEs spend, and get this, 900,000 hours a day chasing payments. Now, in my mind, that's 112,000 people chasing payments, which also means for a buying organization or their customers, they're also being chased. Now, that's nuts. That's completely inefficient for our economy and for supply chains. So simply notifying suppliers when they're going to get paid and how much, I think will take a significant level of the weight, and also reduce the anxiety that businesses have in terms of trade. But then if we can take it a step further and give the customers of those suppliers or the buying organizations a reason not to pay late, not to pay on time, but to actually pay early, I think would be the icing on the cake. And it would mean that those smaller businesses would have access to the knowledge that they're going to get paid and by when, how much they're going to get paid and by when. They would have access to cash a lot sooner, enabling them to invest in their business, becoming more efficient because they're not having to chase payments, see greater results from their productivity, more job creation, more investment, more innovation. And the buyer benefits from exceptional service and the knowledge that they are actually driving social value creation.
And this is also simple. This is also straightforward. So obvious. So what's the problem?
So the problem is
where's the traction into this type of solution? Why are we not seeing it?
The answer is that now we're in a world of connectivity and technology that enables this type of thing to happen. So what we're doing is we're hooking into the ERPs or financial management systems of the buying organizations, enabling them to allow this to happen, to send notification in a way that works for the supplier. So mobile-led, available when you want it. The benefits, we've got to, I constantly hear, that large organizations are the perpetrators of late payments, that they're driving it. Well, actually, rather than keeping hitting them, why not give them a reason to give an early payment to their supply chain? And what I believe is that we've got an opportunity to do that, giving them financial benefit, either through discounts that can be applied to early payments. There's nothing wrong with that on condition that they're not excessive discounts. Giving them an option to potentially extend their own working capital. We've got a model where you can use a card payment, so you can actually extend your payment terms as a buying organization and pay your supplier earlier. Given the operational efficiencies by preventing small businesses having to call and chase payments. Giving new forms of data that gives you insight into your supply chain and the risk that they might pose. And the knowledge that you're supporting your supply chain, you're supporting the smallest businesses, the places where innovation truly happens, those brave organizations, that's doing good and it's doing the right thing. we're in effectively, we're in a world where the technology can absolutely support in terms of delivery of simplicity, convenience, and speed.
Yeah, just to pick up, I mean, one of the things I do with my the work with small businesses, I talk about data analytics, and I say a lot of the issues about cash flow and payment, you're sitting on the data which could actually provide you with a solution. And you talked about ERP, just for our listeners, I just want to make sure that we understand what these acronyms stand for. Enterprise Resource Planning Software, whereby you integrate every bit of software kit you've got in the business and you get complete visibility on everything to do with your finances, but the finances gets hooked up into your CRM system, gets hooked up into payroll as well. All of that speaks to each other. I'm going to come back to you, Philip. I mean, this all sounds grand. We've got a huge productivity problem in the UK, and Ant's been talking about the efficiencies and the productivity gains that we can get from the solutions that he's been talking about. I mean, two questions here. The first one is, should government really what role can government play here, apart from being an advocate? Or do we need that big stick to really say, look, there are some legal recourse for small businesses, but as I've said and established earlier, if you sign up to terms which are 90 days, you're not going to take anyone to court, and many businesses don't want to take businesses to court because they've passed the 30-day limit, which is on the statute. But that's problematic. So, government role, Philip, is there really anything more that government can do, or are we really just saying that more people need to be listening and learning from the sort of solutions that Ant is talking about?
Yes, Mark, government could do more. But before I answer that, a couple of things on what Ant was saying, if I may. 900,000 hours per day being spent by SMEs chasing late payment. What he didn't talk about was the additional time that should have been spent by small businesses chasing late payment, who just don't, who bury their head in the sands. And I talked to hundreds of small businesses when I was SBC, and I said, well, what have you done to chase this late payment? And they said nothing. I just hoped it would arrive. So the 900,000 is probably understated by a massive amount of what should be spent. And I think the other thing is that we talk a lot about large businesses paying small businesses late, but that's not exclusive. Small businesses pay late as well, and medium businesses pay late. It cascades down, and I think one of the pieces of power of Ant's solution is that it applies to all businesses of all sizes and can help. But back to your government point, what government needs to do is to take action rather than tick boxes, in a nutshell. So it has created the Office of the Small Business Commissioner, which is great. There's a consultation out that's been out since some time ago. The consultation closed in December last year. December the year before, 24th of December 2020. The consultation on extending the powers of the Small Business Commissioner closed, but there's been no response from that. The Trust in Audit and Corporate Governance consultation that government's been promising its response on since the turn of the year, we haven't seen yet, and that includes a small section on reporting, transparency around payments. The recent statutory review of the payment practice reporting legislation and regulations found that they were working, but government has failed to address the impact it could have with those regulations. And sadly, from my perspective, what I see is government putting in an initiative, ticking the box once it's been delivered, but not looking at the potential for how much more it could do and how much more effective it could be. I almost guarantee that if you talked to 1,000 small businesses now and said, what is payment practice reporting for large businesses? 900 would have no idea what you were talking about. And yet this was a government measure, and one of its key objectives was to make it more transparent so that small businesses could have an indication of how they'd be paid by their potential large customers. If you don't tell them it's there, how do they know? And government has a role to play in raising awareness of all of this stuff. And sadly, it fails to I'm sure often for good reasons, but it fails to put enough emphasis and focus on getting this information out there. So I don't think that legislation necessarily is the answer. I think that market solutions like Ant's are really important. I think that the ESG agenda, doing the right thing, is really important. Getting businesses to work together as partners is really important. But government has a role to play. And sadly for me, it's too busy ticking the box and moving on to the next thing rather than trying to build on the good work that it's done.
We could perhaps excuse them this year in terms of being distracted. But as I said at the beginning of this conversation, this has been a problem that's been around for decades. And I know, working with Lord Young over the years, that he has sort of seen late payment as one of his crusading issues. And he made progress. But as you say, the progress has not ended up in actually solving the cash flow problem and the late payment issue, because even in the midst of other crises that we're encountering at the moment, with the rising inflationary pressures, as well as the uncertainty in the political environment, geopolitical, as well as just across the channel, it's just been something which is just seen as, well, it's not something which is seen as a priority, and no one's making the connections as you two have done between a more vibrant, competitive, productive small business sector is what you get at the end of this if you help the cash circulate more. I mean, Phil, very quickly, do you think that we are really losing a lot of growth amongst our small businesses because of this issue? That people are so anxious about cash flow that they then postpone investment decisions?
Absolutely, we are. I mean, and touched on this. Small businesses go into business to live a dream, to live a passion, to fulfill something that they believe in and they're passionate about. They don't want to spend their time chasing their customers to pay them. That's not what they're in business for. Ant's solution, as he said, helps to resolve that and remove that distraction. But small business that's not being paid can't invest in people. It can't invest in research. It can't invest in marketing and growing. And if I'm a small business, I don't have confidence I'm going to be paid. I'm not going to risk, bringing my cash reserves down in order to grow, with the fear that I might end up running out of money. And so the risk is that if a small business stagnates and you cascade that out, the whole economy doesn't grow as it should. And let me give you an example, Mark, of the problem with government. The statutory review into the payment practice reporting found in its research and in its background information that signatories to prompt payment code and similar codes were paying better on their reporting information than companies that weren't signatories. And Lord Callanan, the business, the Bays Lord responsible in the Lords for Bays, was asked a question by a peer that said, did government take account of whether businesses were a member of the prompt payment code and a signatory to it before it promoted them? His response was, the prompt payment code isn't statutory and mandatory requirement. End of quote. Now, I picked that up from Hansard. Now, if government doesn't recognise that it's important that big businesses are treating their suppliers well and continues to promote them and encourage people to look at them and so on, there's a complete disconnect there about what it could be doing. And if it was saying to large businesses, we will not promote you unless you behave well on modern slavery, on gender equality, on prompt payment, and all of these things, that would send a really strong message out to large businesses. And it's not doing that.
No, and well, I think that point is well made. And I'm going to come to you and ask you the same question. You work with a lot of small businesses now, in terms of promoting your particular, help to them in terms of cash flow. What do you see the difference, but after you've worked with the business or getting more cash into the business? Do you actually see that growth and that investment, that sort of being not just like dropping anxiety levels, but actually leading to greater levels of, as Philip said, getting back to what they set up the business to do, which was run a successful, competitive business? Do you actually see evidence of that before and after?
So I don't think that the two things should be not be put together, because I think anxiety results in businesses losing confidence in their ability to be able to deliver and to make those decisions. Actually giving them the access to liquidity gives them the level of confidence to make those decisions, to grow their businesses. And absolutely, Mark, we for sure, when you drive cash into businesses, it enables them to have the confidence to make those investment decisions, to bring in new jobs, to invest in their future, to grow. and we see it all of the time. So absolutely.
So in terms of the solution, how would you describe your solution in a couple of sentences, Ant?
So what we do is we notify a supplier that they're going to get paid and by when, but we also give them the option of getting paid sooner, potentially in exchange for a discount, but we don't dictate that. We give that into the hands of their customer, the buying organization. For the buyer, they get those 4 key elements of benefit. So number 1 is financial benefit through potentially discounts or working capital benefit if they were to extend the terms using our card model. Operational efficiencies by not having to have your suppliers chasing payments, the data, knowing which suppliers are taking an early payment, how quickly they're taking it, etc. And finally, the knowledge that they're supporting their supply chain and driving true social value creation.
Right. Thanks very much, Ant. I mean, in terms of trying to come to the sort of summarize this conversation, this is a conversation which I know that we in the Research Centre will be revisiting. And the present incumbent of the Small Business Commissioner Office, Philip Liz Barkley, will be coming to speak at our annual conference later in the year. So this is a conversation which will continue. It's a problem that will, dare I say it, take a long time to resolve, because the sort of solutions that you're talking about take a long time to seed in the minds of people, to see the actual benefits of what you're doing. But I want to give you both an opportunity to have some final comments as we come to the end of our time today in this podcast. So, Ant, you first of all, please, if I may.
So I don't think it has to be that difficult for businesses to benefit, both buy side and supply side. Technology is there. We should absolutely embrace technology. I think that we should focus on early payments. Let's try and move away from the late payment conversation. And thirdly, and most importantly, I think that it's about doing the right thing and focusing on that.
Okay, thanks, Ant. And over to you, Philip, for some final comments.
Yeah, I'd just like to re-emphasize what Ant has said. And if I was a micro business and I got a text that said, your invoice for £1,000 has now been approved, do you want payment today in return for a small discount, or do you want to wait till it comes out in 30 days' time? That would be so powerful for me that I think this is a really good solution. But I think in terms of a final remark, all I would say is that businesses, government, and large and small businesses need to work in partnership. So government needs to push a message out. Businesses need to recognise suppliers as partners, not as a third party that's distant. And if they recognise them as partners, they will treat them well, and the whole of business and the economy will benefit.
Okay, thanks very much, Philip, and thanks as well to Ant. I think that's been a very thought-provoking conversation today. I'd like to thank everyone for listening to this podcast. It's number 10 in the series. If you've enjoyed it, interested in finding out a lot more about the work of the Enterprise Research Centre, please visit our website, www.enterpriseresearch.ac.uk. Thank you very much for listening.